horror. My personal favorite genre, and perhaps yours too. There's such a variety when it comes to horror films. There's so many different types. You have psychological, slasher, gore, alien, suspense, monster films, and the list goes on. There's a lot of creativity that comes to mind when you think of various horror films, and like I said, horror films have been around for so long, and they will continue to exist until the future. With that being said though, there are some horror films that stand out amongst the rest, and so today I will be counting down the top 5 horror films of all time. This is a very hard list to make, you guys, and remember that these are all my opinions. So while I do think most of these horror films stand as critics' and audiences' personal favorites as well, they are my opinions, so if a film is not on this list, or is, and you think it should have a different ranking, leave your top 5 in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this list, and let me know what you think about my opinions. Also, let me know what is your favorite and least favorite horror film that you've ever seen in the comments below. With that being said though, let's jump into the top 5 horror films. Kicking off the list at number 5, we have the ever so iconic
Take a little walk to the edge of town.
Scream. Scream was essentially a monumental horror film in the late 1990s. The slasher craze was dying down after Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers beat themselves to death with sequel after sequel after sequel, so there needed to be something fresh, something new in the slasher genre. Thus, the self-referential, funny, yet terrifying Scream was introduced. Directed by Wes Craven, this is my personal favorite of his films. I know most people love the Nightmare on Elm Street films, and while they aren't terrible, they definitely don't compare to Scream and its sequels. I think what makes Scream so interesting and compelling is its realism. It actually could happen. It's not a zombie or a ghost. It's just somebody wearing a Halloween costume that tries to kill their friends. It's very terrifying stuff, but the film is also very interesting, very entertaining throughout, very scary in many scenes, especially that opening sequence with Drew Barrymore. It's definitely a chilling movie, and it all comes together in one great package under Wes Craven's amazing direction. I love the classic look of Ghostface, the iconic soundtrack and score, and I just overall think this movie deserves more praise. A lot of people don't talk about Scream as much nowadays, and I really think they should. It's certainly a monumental horror classic. Moving on to number 4, we have the ever so amazing Psycho. Most critics agree that Psycho is one of, if not the best horror film ever made, and I can most certainly agree. Directed by the master himself, Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho follows the story of Norman Bates, owner of Bates Motel, and when a woman by the name of Marion Crane checks in, she doesn't check out the following morning. You see, Norman has a bit of a split personality, and some very psychotic, may I say, things go on inside of Bates Motel. This movie is filled with such atmosphere, suspense, the amazing score, Alfred Hitchcock behind the entire ship of this film sailing into what has become now a cult and classic film standard. Psycho holds up as one of the best horror films ever, and it really kicked off the slasher genre. Whereas there are some other slashers before Psycho, Psycho is the one that popularized the term. It shot up Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, into the spotlight of horror icons, and it still stands as one of the best directed and well-made horror films ever made. Especially considering that Alfred Hitchcock funded the film himself, it truly does stand as an amazing piece of film. Moving on to number 3, we have the ever so timeless Halloween. Halloween from 1978, directed by John Carpenter, stands as what happens when a low-budget film becomes a cult classic. This film was made on a budget of around $300,000 and grossed over $70 million, and it stands as my personal favorite slasher film. Whereas films like, the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises have their killers go off and off, being killed and resurrected, Halloween alone, not counting its sequels, just Halloween, stands as what happens when a small town encounters the boogeyman, and truly, evil himself. What's interesting also is just the simplicity of Michael Myers. It's a white spray-painted William Shatner mask. It's nothing special, but evil, and the psychotic state of Michael Myers can be portrayed in such a great way throughout the film. This movie has my personal favorite horror soundtrack of all time. John Carpenter composed it all by himself, and he does such an amazing job. It's so iconic, that classic score, the haunting and chilling score of Halloween. Not to mention Michael Myers, Donald Pleasence, Jamie Lee Curtis, the amazing atmosphere from this film, and that creepy yet ever so provoking ending. Halloween stands as one of the best horror films ever made. Let's move on to number 2, which goes to another classic. The Exorcist. Based off of the William Peter Blatty novel, The Exorcist tells the story of a little girl, Regan McNeil, who becomes possessed by a demon, or perhaps the devil himself. Most people consider The Exorcist to be one of the scariest films ever made, and I most certainly can agree. The acting, especially the amazing Linda Blair, as well as the soundtrack, the character development throughout the film, the amazing cinematography, the special effects, everything that goes into this movie makes it a chilling, classic horror film. There's many different storylines going throughout the movie. You have Regan McNeil with her mother, who are trying to figure out what's going on with Regan's situation as they talk to scientists about her case. At the same time, you have a priest dealing with his faith, and another priest, a more, I guess you would say, supreme priest in the Exorcist field, dealing with this demonic force, this demonic presence, and it all builds up very suspensefully to this amazing climax where the exorcism actually takes place. This scene you're probably most familiar with. This movie is chilling. It's a slow burner, so it may seem a little bit boring at first, but it all has these little pieces of a storyline coming together to make for one fantastic ending and conclusion to what is one of the best horror films, and perhaps one of the scariest ever made. But now, it's time to move to my number 1 spot, my personal favorite horror film ever made. Maybe you saw this coming, maybe you didn't, but my favorite horror movie of all time, and perhaps yours, goes to, well, I think you know. The Shining. That's right. Stanley Kubrick's horror masterpiece is my personal favorite horror film of all time. It's also voted by many audiences and critics as the best horror film of all time, and I most certainly can agree. The film that was based off of Stephen King's novel of the same name tells the story of the Torrance family as they have to watch over the Overlook Hotel. Jack, Wendy, and Danny quickly discover that the hotel is much darker than it initially appeared. They also realize that the hotel, as well as Danny and the head chef Halloran, also have this ability, this psychic ability, called, you guessed it, The Shining. This film has my personal favorite use of cinematography in any movie. Many other people have tried to replicate The Shining, but it just can't be done. Stanley Kubrick knows exactly what he's doing, and he nailed it to a T. This movie is the definition of atmospheric. It's creepy, it's secluded, it's isolated, it's disturbing. There's also many scenes throughout this film that just stand out entirely, but you really have to watch the entire film to get that creepy atmosphere that only comes from The Shining. I can't talk about this movie without talking about the amazing performances by Danny Lloyd and, of course, by Jack Nicholson himself. I also have to say, Shelley Duvall did an amazing job as well. I know a lot of people critique her for this movie, but she still did a fantastic job as Wendy, and she really sells the horror of this movie with her very dismayed performance. With all that being said, The Shining stands as an example of what can happen when horror is put in the right hands, and I consider it to be my favorite horror movie ever made. However, your opinion may be different, so what are your top 5 horror films? Let me know, and everyone else, in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember as always, for all things Halloween and horror, this is Haunt-Former.